Welcome to the 7th episode of the mighty eunuchs or transgenders in the span of humanity. They seized his home, his freedom, and his manhood. He took their empire in return. A man with no name, no blood, no plan for a dynasty, and no hope of a dynasty became the most powerful individual in the Ottoman world. A slave, a guard, a shadow made to be invisible, but in the gilded cage of the Topkapi palace. A setting of whispered silks and sharpened knives. This shadow learned to consume the light. His name was Hacı Beşir Agha. His story shows that in the game of empires not everyone on the throne is the most dangerous player. So, how can a man rise so high he has come from such a low in life down to such a momentous stage? The first thing you need to do is understand his world. The Ottoman Empire was a vast, glorious, and frankly terrifying place in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. At its center wasn't a battlefield or a throne room. It was a labyrinth of courtyards and corridors tucked in Istanbul, the Topkapi Palace, and within and around that palace, behind the courts of ministers and elite soldiers, sat the most secret and guarded quarters, the imperial harem. Now, the Western imagination tends to make the harem some sort of erotic paradise for the Sultan. The reality, infinitely more intricate and so much more dangerous. It was not a brothel, it was the dynastic heart of the empire. Consider it a closed-door city of women, the Sultan's mother, the mighty Valide Sultan, his wives and concubines, their offspring, the princes and princesses, and an army of servants. This was the gilded cage where the empire's future was literally born and raised. And because of that, it was a political battleground of unmatched ferocity. I am Tsar, teaching a lowly common man about the history of the most potent eunuchs or transgenders. Every smile could conceal a scheme. A conversation that was supposed to be polite might be an interrogation instead. Women in the harem, many of them slaves from other lands, vied for power, for honor, and for the high road, getting their son on the throne. They made alliances, overthrew rivals, and whispered in the Sultan's ear that affected everything from court appointments to declarations of war. It was a sorority of shared confinement, yes, but it was also a viper's nest where a singular mistake could land you in oblivion, banishment, or a hushed invisible death. Enter this land of feminine might and deadly machinations, and there was no man's way in, only the eunuch. Castrated, unable to have children, but without family allegiances to distract them, they were the ideal, incorruptible stewards. They were the link between the male world of the outer palace and the female world of the inner sanctum. The gatekeepers, the messengers, the jailers, they were supposed to be instruments of power and authority, instruments for the Sultan, whose very being had been ripped from under, and the tools they used to carry this out. They were meant to be powerless. But here, in the opulence of silk and steel, it was time for one of these men to show that power is not from anything you have to hold, but only that which you know well. He would prove to everyone that the perfect servant could grow to the highest of masters. Of course his story didn't always begin in glorious glory. It started in terror and blood, and the obliteration of everything that is humanly possible. Long before he was Hacı Beşir Agha, a name that might make grand men tremble, surely, one day, he was merely a boy in Abyssinia, now Ethiopia. We didn't know his birth name. History does not bear it, too, because to the men who robbed him it did not matter. He was cargo, he wasn't a human. Snatched from his native land in the late 17th century, he was tossed into the cruel gears of the East African slave trade. Childhood was a nightmare of forced marches, chains, and slave markets in which people were examined and sold like livestock. His destination was the Ottoman Empire, but a stop along the way marked his path in life entirely. In Egypt he and many thousands of other young boys were sentenced to castration. It was not the work of talented surgeons. It was often done in grim, secretive workshops, observers say. It was an extremely efficient, horribly dangerous process. There would be a boy caught in place, his genitals taken out with a swift motion of a razor. The wound was then cauterized with boiling oil and a plug placed that kept the urethra from closing. Its survival rate was appalling. Countless boys died of infection, shock and blood loss. Those who lived, however, were forever scarred, not only physically but psychologically. They were left permanent, not wholly male or female. Their voice wouldn't deepen. They wouldn't grow beards. They were transformed into something else. For the Ottoman court, that was the entire point. There were two main classes of eunuchs: white eunuchs from the Balkans or the Caucasus, who served in the outer palace, and black eunuchs from East Africa, who had exclusive control over the imperial harem. This was a brutal mix of racism and political calculation. Racist theories of the time considered them less tempting to the harem women. Crucially, and no less importantly, their origins were a political asset. Torn from their homes thousands of miles away, with their families lost and their bodies unable to create a new lineage, they had no one to be loyal to but the Sultan. If they ever acquired any, it could not be passed down. Theoretically, they were the perfect slaves. The boy who would become Beşir Agha survived. He survived the slave markets, the razor, and the crushing despair. He was sold, brought to Istanbul, and presented to Topkapi Palace. He had been robbed of everything. He was now a Kizlar Agha in training, an Agha of the girls. He had assumed a new name and a new identity, fully defined by servitude. He was a shadowy creature, built to fade from view. Now he was a piece of imperial property. The arrival at Topkapi wasn't the ticket to a life of luxury. For a junior eunuch, it was the beginning of a new, brutal education. The boy, whom we now call Beşir, was forced into a world in which the hierarchy of command itself was inflexible and unforgiving, and he was at the absolute bottom. The harem was overseen by the chief black eunuch, the Kizlar Agha, a slave who had only second, placed title after that of the Grand Vizier. There was an entire pyramid of other eunuchs below him, all with their own rank. Beşir began as a beginner and a semi-ogre. Day to day his life was grueling, but it was lived under the watchful eye. He and the other novices lived in cramped quarters, a world away from the opulent chambers they were sworn to protect. They went about their days doing all sorts of lessons and boring dutiful work. They were shown the elaborate etiquette of the court, how to walk, how to speak, how to bow. The main lesson, invisibility. They were to be the eyes and ears of the Kizlar Agha, but see or hear nothing not their business. Discipline was harsh. The whip was an ever-present deterrent for the smallest error, a look lingering too long or a word uttered out of turn. But this was not just a place for guards to train. So too was its training ground refined. Beşir learned Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. He studied the Koran and Islamic law, too. The harem eunuchs weren't created to be ignorant brutes. They had to be cultured enough to administer the intricate and diverse administration of the Sultan's private world. This is where Beşir began to shine. But in a world specifically calibrated to crush individuality, his ambition multiplied. Not only had people learned to behave and obey like others, Beşir showed what it is to be observant. The environment was not all about obedience, but rather as a way to observe. There was this web of secrets running through the harem, but he was a eunuch, and he moved through it like a ghost. He could sense the rivalries among the Sultan's consorts. He heard the murmured schemes. He discovered what the powerful people in the empire wanted most, treasured, and didn't know well. For although the Sultan's mother might have his ear, it was the eunuchs who controlled who got to see her. He was a phantom running through the machine, and he was understanding how the machine operated from within. That real power was not just the Sultan's proclamation, it was the knowledge that informed that proclamation. He put every secret, every rumor, every slight aside, his mind forging on a weapon in the silence and subjugation of his training. His body had shattered, but his intellect was sharpening into a razor-sharp blade. He had been waiting around for his time, one rung on the ladder at a time. Years passed. Beşir was no longer the terrified boy in chains. He walked the harem's gilded corridors with a restrained assuredness. His rise was not a meteoric one. It was a creeping, methodical building of trust. He learned the art of being irreplaceable. And while other eunuchs became more satisfied with serving as guards, Beşir established himself as a living library of institutional knowledge. He flourished, first being employed in the palace in Cairo, before being taken back to the center of power in Istanbul. So in 1707 he had risen to harem treasurer. This was a huge leap. he had become more than a guard. He had become a key administrator, responsible for the accounts of the harem's vast financial operations. He managed the budgets for jewels, clothing, food, and salaries for hundreds of people. This function bestowed upon him a new force. He was getting more than gossip. He was seeing power projected onto a balance sheet. He knew which of the Sultan's favorites had the most lavish gifts. He knew the financial state of the Valide Sultan's household. He knew it was such a fine thing that money was a river through the palace, and by running its currents he could aid allies he was able to help, and satisfy their hunger by doing what they desired. He did his job with a particular skill at the finer distinctions, and thereby has cultivated a reputation of his being incredibly efficient, and to the less well-intentioned in many ways, though trustworthy. It seemed he was the perfect servant to everyone at court, capable and intelligent, but without his own project of action, or so they thought. Beshir didn't stop at bookkeeping. He cultivated his network. He was the confidant to concubines, a servant to the Sultan's mother, who treated him politely, and a mentor to young eunuchs, but perhaps his most important role was being close to the young princes. The princes were kept in a section of harem called the Caves, which was to be a cage, an isolated but lavish and closed off prison aimed at preventing them from starting any kind of revolt. Beshir was one of their only links to the outside world. He noticed which princes were bright, and which were dull, cruel, and kind. He wasn't merely their guard, he was among their first teachers. He could subtly frame their world view, their understanding of power. By planting seeds into the minds of future sultans, he was making a long-term investment that would go well beyond any amount imaginable. He was playing a game with others who, after all, were unaware of it, and who themselves hadn't even thought about taking part in it. And just as Beshir's influence was becoming undeniable, his career halted shockingly. In 1713, after an Ottoman account leaves frustratingly vague why, he was stripped of his titles and exiled. He was dispatched from the center of the empire, initially to Cyprus and then to Egypt. This was a career death sentence for any other courtier. Exile was the political graveyard of the Ottoman Empire. The absence of a specific justification is telling. That speaks to the shadows of harem politics. Did he side with the wrong person in a disagreement? Did he discover a secret so dangerous he had to get fired? His sheer competence, it's likely, had rendered him a threat. He simply knew too much. For Beshir, a man already aged about 60, this might have been the end. He had spent his entire life climbing this slippery ladder, only to be thrown down. But the qualities that had helped him to rise up, patience, intelligence, resilience, all of these made sure he would survive. He didn't despair. His exile ultimately led him to Mecca and Medina, where he received a dignified but powerless position supervising the holy sites. He had become out of the game, but was not forgotten. Back in Istanbul, the court continued to connive, and it appears the powerful had an epiphany. They needed him now. Maybe the harem's regime had begun to unravel. Or perhaps a mighty ally, perhaps the Valide Sultan herself, came to the conclusion that Beshir's skills were too valuable to abandon rusting to the exile. And thus the unthinkable occurred. In 1716, the old eunuch was recalled to Istanbul after a few years in the political wilderness. He wasn't merely pardoned, he was conferred with the highest order, and the very person who cast him out as a danger is at this point given the highest position that a eunuch could possibly attain. At about 60 years old, Hacı Beşir Agha became known as the Kizlar Agha, the Ottoman Empire's chief black eunuch. His exile had not been a failure, it had been a crucible. It had tested and ultimately made him indispensable. He had passed out on fire and back, hardened, not scarred. He was no longer merely a clever treasurer. He was a survivor, and now he was in charge of one of the 3 most powerful offices in the entire empire. The shadow had returned. By this point, the position in which it could manage the palace was in the picture. As Kizlar Agha, Hacı Beşir Agha was now the ruler of the world he'd once served on his knees. The terms, Agha of the girls, might sound simple only to some, but his power was an assault on the state in 3 aspects. First and foremost, he was the absolute ruler of the imperial harem's court. Every person within there, from the lowest of staff to the most favored concubine, was answerable to him. He served as chief administrative officer, chief security officer, and chief disciplinarian in the empire at the time. He controlled who entered and left, and served as the only conduit for all correspondence between the harem and the outside world. Even the Grand Vizier, the head of the government, could not speak with the Sultan's mother unless he went through Beşir Agha. He was the absolute gatekeeper of the people. Second, he occupied enormous political power. The Kizlar Agha was the main link between the Sultan, the Valide Sultan, and the Grand Vizier. Since he could roam in and out of the male and female realms of the palace, he was basically the instrument through which such messages, petitions, and secrets spread. He didn't just serve as messenger, he was a filter, a strategist who could counsel the Sultan's mother and forge alliances with or against the Grand Vizier. Foreign ambassadors swiftly discovered that they needed to go to the Sultan's chief eunuch before they could get to the Sultan. An invisible minister of the interior, his influence was felt in every sphere of government. Third, and this was the massive one, the Kizlar Agha ruled over something that ran through the boundaries of the palace, the imperial waqfs for the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Waqfs were enormous religious holdings, land, markets, shops, villages, and their money went toward charity. The endowments for the holy cities were the empire's biggest, a colossal source of revenue. Beşir Agha, as administrator of these waqfs, governed a financial empire. He had agents collecting revenues in every province. They gave him financial autonomy that even the Grand Vizier could not surpass. He could work with that wealth to pay off all his own projects, reward his allies with jobs, and lay a vast network of personal clients loyal to him. This was not only his function as a court official, but also as the executive principal of the most significant charitable foundation in the entire empire. These factors, close access, political power, and the ability to influence politics, made Kizlar Agha the third most powerful office of all, right after the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. And now, in the hands of this man, his own master, an office that had for generations been a toolbox for cultivating power from below. Hacı Beşir Agha was no longer a player in it, but was now about to become the master of it. He was appointed in the time of Sultan Ahmed Roman III, but this governing body had a heavy dependence on the Grand Vizier. Within the year, Beşir realized the current Grand Vizier was simply not going to do. He required an ally, one who owed him something in return both politically and legally in the top job of government. What followed was a masterclass in political manipulation. No coups, no rebellions. His tactics were much more subtle and much more effective. He began with the unique position of whisperer-in-chief. By way of the Valide Sultan, he sowed uncertainty about whether the Grand Vizier was capable. He emphasized policy failures, circulated rumors of corruption, and subtly portrayed the Vizier as a menace. His vast intelligence web of the eunuchs and servants he trained for decades, at the same time, however, gathered dirt. Every error the Grand Vizier encountered, every secret talk, leaked all the way to Beşir Agha. He was constructing a case, not for a court of law, but for a court of palace opinion. His chosen successor was the man Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha. Ibrahim Pasha had been a politician of high standing, at least initially. But what was better was Beşir knew that it was possible to control him. He began to promote Ibrahim in court, ensuring that his victories were celebrated, while the current vizier's letdown was magnified. It was a steady, silent political assassination campaign. The final decision was firm. Leveraging the power of influence with the Sultan and his mother, Beşir argued his case. The Grand Vizier was a liability, and here was the ideal successor, the loyal, genius Ibrahim Pasha. The Sultan believed him and accepted. In an amazing display of power, the Grand Vizier was pushed aside, replaced by Hacı Beşir Agha's man. Beşir had become a kingmaker. He had selected and deposed the second most powerful person in the empire without shedding a single drop of blood. His office had become a shadow premiership. From then on, his collaboration with Ibrahim Pasha would shape a whole epoch. Beşir was power behind the throne, and Ibrahim Pasha in his public face. The strings had now been fully manipulated by the puppet master. The collaboration of Beşir Agha with his purposive Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, ushered in the most unique span in Ottoman history, the tulip era. The era lasted from ca. 1730 BC, and was named for the court's obsession with the delicate flower, a symbol of a new era of peace, culture, and luxury. The empire's face looked inward and westward on the surface. Vast palaces and ornate fountains sprang up along the Bosphorus. The court hosted lavish garden parties, each filled with thousands of candles hung on the backs of tortoises. It was the first Ottoman printing press. Embassies had been dispatched to Paris and Vienna, not to discuss war, but to learn about European art, architecture, and society. It was an era of elegance and poetry, but it was Ibrahim Pasha who was the public architect of all this. He was the patron of the arts, the diplomat, the enlightened statesman, but there, behind him in the shadows, was Hacı Beşir Agha. If Ibrahim Pasha oversaw the empire's image in the public world, Bashir oversaw the empire's management. His control over the harem meant the Sultan's domestic life was well maintained, and his control over the Waqf finances provided an uninterrupted supply of cash to reward allies and build projects. His influence was absolute. To be given high office of any kind was someone who could not but have their petitions through Beşir Agha first. His advice was everything. His disapproval was a career killer. When European ambassadors came, they learned the new rules fast. Before they could even possibly catch a glimpse of the Sultan, they had to pay their respects and their bribes to the chief eunuch. His favor was the key that unlocked every other door. He was now on the top of his class. A man who had nothing, not his own body, he, very easily, was the ruler of his state. A slave, he appointed free men in offices of prime importance. As someone who had virtually no possibility of having a family, he governed the destiny of the great families of the empire. The paradox was complete. This boy from Abyssinia had been mutilated and sold into servitude, and now he was the secret emperor of the Ottoman world. It's a wild thought that a man who didn't own property, but was legally granted full rights to its property, could control so much of the empire's wealth and future. If you're intrigued about this power story like me, click subscribe for a second. We get into these wild stories every week, and you still have to get through the next one, because for Hacı Beşir Agha, surviving court politics was one thing. To survive a full-blown rebellion that brought this entire sparkling era crashing down, that was something else altogether. The tulip era's opulence came at a cost. As the Istanbul elite feasted on a fantasy of poetry and pleasure, discontent was brewing among the general population and the military. The new Western fashions and extravagant consumption, it seemed to them, were not innovations but decadence and a betrayal of the tradition. The economy was suffering. The state was spending fortunes on palaces. That resentment boiled over in 1730. Patrona Halil, a former janissary working in a bathhouse, ignited the rebellion. He was not a general, nor was he a statesman. He was a man of the people, and he was the face of all the anger in the capital. He whipped a small mob together into a mob of followers who took their marching march on the Grand Bazaar, and it spread like wildfire. The city spun into a quagmire. The mob demanded an end to new taxes, an end to the Western decadence, and the heads of the men they held responsible. Their list was short. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, and his closest allies, Sultan Ahmed Roman III, who had grown soft during the years of peace, panicked. The government that seemed so powerful just weeks before completely collapsed. To save his own throne, the Sultan made a terrible choice. He gave in to the mob's demands. His lifelong friend and Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, the architect of the tulip era, was executed, and his body was handed over to the rebels. The tulip era was over, drowned in blood, but the mob wasn't satisfied. They forced Sultan Ahmed Roman III to abdicate in favor of his nephew, Mahmud I. In this storm of violence and betrayal, one man should have been a primary target, Hacı Beşir Agha. He was the other pillar of the regime, Ibrahim Pasha's partner in power. His fall should have been inevitable, and yet, when the dust settled, Hacı Beşir Agha was still standing. How did he survive? This was perhaps his greatest masterpiece. While Ibrahim Pasha was the public face of the era, Beşir had always operated from the shadows. He had cultivated an image not just as a political operator, but also as a pious and charitable figure. More importantly, he had a direct line to the new Sultan, Mahmud I. Bashir had been the one to oversee Mahmud's education during his long years of confinement in the caves. The new Sultan knew, and crucially, trusted the old eunuch. He was a familiar, stabilizing presence in a world turned upside down. Beşir Agha was too useful, too powerful, and too deeply embedded in the machinery of the state to be removed. He had made himself indispensable. So, while his ally's body was torn apart by the mob, Bashir seamlessly transitioned his power to the new regime. He hadn't just weathered the storm, he had proven he was a permanent fixture, as immovable as the palace walls themselves. After surviving the political earthquake of 1730, Bashir Agha's power under the new Sultan, Mahmud I, became even more absolute. With his old partner gone, he was now the undisputed elder statesman, the most experienced political operator in the empire. But in the later years of his life, another side of his character came to the forefront. He began using his immense wealth and influence not just for political gain, but to shape the empire's religious and intellectual identity. He took his title, Protector of the Holy Places, seriously. He made sure the annual pilgrimage to Mecca was well funded and secure, but his patronage went far beyond his official duties. Using his colossal personal wealth, he launched one of the most ambitious campaigns of architectural and educational philanthropy the empire had ever seen. Mosques, libraries, schools, and fountains sprung up across the empire, all funded by him. In Istanbul, he commissioned a major complex including a mosque, a theological school, and a library. He built another renowned school in the sacred district of Ayub. His projects weren't just in the capital. He funded buildings in Chios, Medina, and Cairo, the very city where his journey as a palace eunuch had begun. This wasn't just about vanity. Bashir Agha had a clear agenda. He was a devout follower of the Hanafi school of Sunni Islam, the official legal tradition of the Ottoman state. His endowment specifically promoted Hanafi scholarship, funding the training of imams, judges, and teachers. He was, in effect, propagating an Ottoman brand of Islam, orthodox, institutional, and tied to the state. He was also a genuine intellectual. His personal library was legendary. When he died, a trove of precious books was found in his quarters. The libraries he founded were stocked with canonical works of Islamic law, theology, and science, creating intellectual centers that would shape generations of scholars. This public piety and vast charity created a new image for Bashir Agha. He was no longer just the shadowy puppet master. He was a great patron of the faith, a builder, a scholar. It was a brilliant move. It insulated him from political enemies and created a powerful public legacy that stood apart from the secret dealings of the court. He was simultaneously the most feared political operator and one of the most revered philanthropists in the empire. Bashir Agha died on June 3, 1746. He was in his 90s and almost unheard of age for the 18th century. He died in Topkapi Palace, the place that had been his prison, his university, and his kingdom. He died while still holding the office of Kizlar Agha, a position he'd held for nearly 30 years, an unmatched tenure. In his long and brutal life, he had completed an impossible journey. He began as a nameless boy from Ethiopia, a victim of the slave trade, mutilated and sold into servitude. He ended his life as one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire. For 3 decades, he was the fixed point around which the tumultuous world of Ottoman politics revolved. He served 2 sultans, appointed and deposed countless viziers, and survived a bloody rebellion that toppled his patrons. He elevated the office of the Kizlar Agha to its absolute zenith, solidifying it as a third pillar of the state. He proved that in the paranoid world of the palace, ultimate power didn't belong to the warrior with the strongest army. It belonged to the one with the best information, the deepest networks, and the most unwavering patience. His very nature as a eunuch, designed to be a weakness, became his greatest strength. With no family to promote, he was seen as an honest broker. With no dynasty to found, his loyalty to the reigning sultan appeared absolute. He accumulated power for its own sake, and in his perfection as a servant of the state, he became its master. His legacy was written in the stones of the mosques he built, and in the political DNA of the empire he so thoroughly controlled. The long shadow he cast would stretch over the Ottoman court for decades, a permanent reminder of the castrated kingmaker who ruled an empire from the silent world of the Harem. The story of Hacı Beşir Agha is more than just a biography. It's a profound and unsettling lesson about the nature of power. He started with nothing, stripped of his identity, freedom, and future. He was a ghost, a function, a tool. But from that position of absolute powerlessness, he reverse-engineered the entire system. He turned his weaknesses into strengths. His lack of family made him trustworthy. His confinement gave him unparalleled access to secrets. His emasculation gave him a singular, ice-cold focus. He mastered the art of being underestimated. While others postured and fought for public glory, he accumulated real power in the quiet, unseen spaces of the court. Hacı Beşir Agha's story is a brutal testament that the most dangerous player isn't always the one on the throne. Sometimes it's the person standing in the shadows, the one nobody is watching. What do you think is the ultimate source of power? A crown, a sword, or the secrets no one else can hear? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more hidden stories of power from history, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.